Okay, I think we're all here. I don't know whether this is going to record it or not. So, my name is James Kass. I have been giving this lecture for the last 12 years or so, and I think this is the right course. Space psychology, space medicine, right? Okay, good. We're going to go into the psychological issues of long-duration space missions. And this lecture, which is 2 hours, which I will try to compress to 2 hours, has 6 parts. I'll first introduce you, well, I'll introduce you to myself also, but introduce you to the problems and consequences. We will go into countermeasures and research. Very briefly, look at some journals from the ISS. That'll be the first hour. And then the second hour, we're going to look at some tools regarding groups and group dynamics, such as leadership, which is very important in a team, and even more important is handling conflict. And then the very future, Mars, which is not that far away, and I want to reserve the last 15 minutes for that. So if at 1:45 I don't get to that point, interrupt me and tell me, because it's very interesting. So I'll yes, I'm on this one. Okay. So I will tell you a little bit about myself. Now, I just want to say regarding posting of lectures, some of you are taking a lot of copious notes. You can do so, but you will get the PowerPoint afterwards. So that's not a problem. It's going to be posted for you, and you can download the PDF of all the PowerPoint presentation. So you will have everything that's written on there. However, any extra notes that you think about, of course, write down. But don't bother copying that, what you see up there, because you'll get it anyway. So you can relax and enjoy yourself without having to take too many notes. I'm trying to record this at the same time, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be successful. Somebody has placed here a dictaphone, and maybe afterwards you can also put this on the internet as well, and you can have that recording as well. Just to tell you about myself, some people have asked me whether I'm a psychologist. By training, I'm not a psychologist. I'm actually a physicist. And in case you are wondering what you are studying about and whether you will always do this all your lives, well, you might not. I started out in nuclear physics. I went on to neurophysiology, which took me into the neurophysiology and weightlessness in spaceflight. I went into medical technology, behavioral and operational psychology, where I became an associate professor, and did some telemedicine and e-health. Then I branched out very broadly into looking at integrated space applications and using all of these space infrastructure for humans, for applications here on Earth, knowledge management, data privacy, lessons learned, and lastly, Mars 1. I'll tell you all about Mars 1, where I'm an advisor, and we're hoping to send people to Mars pretty soon. Well, we'll see. This is some selected reading. It's a bit out of date. I don't even know. There must be a newer edition of Nick Kass and Dietrich Manze's book. It's more of a textbook on space psychology. So I believe they must have it here available. Kevin Fong should make it available for you in case you really want to look into deep analysis of space psychology. It gives you a lot of good references. There must be a newer edition now. An even older book, Patricia Santi, Choosing the Right Stuff. She writes about all the problems regarding choosing the right stuff in spaceflight. It's a very candid book. I think she lost her job as a result of it. She used to work for NASA. And Dragonfly is a very interesting book. It's a challenging book. It tells about the Americans working on the Mir station in preparation for the ISS. And there were a lot of problems, psychological, cultural, etc. I liked the book particularly because I knew many of the characters in the book. It talks about the problems in Star City and the training and everything else before the mission. And I was there actually when it happened, and I knew many of the people involved. So I know a lot of the The journalist was very good, and he really, the writer is very good, and he really has done a good job of capturing it, because the little information I knew about was very accurately portrayed in this book. This is not me, this is somebody else, actually related to me. There is a whole series of books by Ray Kass on group dynamics, which are very useful in case you are interested in going into group dynamics in general, not necessarily with space flights, but the behavior of groups. Then you can look on the internet and see there is a whole series of books on it, and they're based on a lot of practical work, not just theory. It's really practical down to earth. Then, of course, there is a Mars 500 simulation where people were shut up. I'll give you a more updated reference list on the internet, on the university internet. And, of course, there is the Sphinx mission, there is the Arctic expeditions, and lastly, there is the most recent Mars 1 mission. So, now for the first part 1, and we'll have to go through this fairly quickly. Don't worry about it. You will find it all, you can read all about it. I'm going through it a bit quickly so that I will make sure that we get to the interesting parts and allow you more time to talk, to ask questions. Don't hesitate to raise your hand and interrupt me, because I will just keep talking, and I can fill the whole time by talking. So if you don't interrupt me, I'll just keep talking all the time. The domain, where does it apply? Of course, we are talking about long-duration human spaceflight, so it's mainly right now the poor astronauts are rotating round and round and round and round the Earth for whatever purpose. I think it gets boring after a few thousand orbits, and this has been going on for years. I was involved in the early space flights in the, where we started doing experiments. Back in the early 80s, well, actually in the late 70s, obviously we had the Russians with Soyuz and the Americans with Skylab. This was the pioneering days, but they were technological missions, very interesting. And then we had the early Space Lab missions, where we started doing the first experiments. International experiments. There were about 100 experiments on the first Space Lab space shuttle mission back in 1983, which I was involved in, and there were on board at least one European astronaut on Space Lab 1 and on Space Lab D1. 2 years later, there were 2 or 3 of them. We are also interested in the application of the moon, but more interesting is Mars and the planets, because these are really far away, and if you're going to go there, you may not come back. You may settle there. You really want to do that? I don't. But anyway, some people do. Now, you have also analog domains, which we should talk about. There are extreme environments, exploration, Arctic expeditions, etc., which have similar type of problems. So where does this apply? It applies there as well. But probably, how many of you think you're going to go into space one day? Nobody. Okay. Oh, one. Very good. So most of you are not going to go into space. So you say, well, what am I doing all this for? Well, this course in space psychology of groups will apply in your everyday life. You are always going to be working with groups. You won't be working in space, but a lot of the problems I will be talking about regarding long-duration group dynamics are entirely applicable on the Earth. It's just the problems are slightly exacerbated in space, but the problems are very similar. And you can apply them in your everyday life, in your work. How many of you are going to be medical doctors or nurses? Ah, a number. That's very good, because I do believe this is very important for your profession, because you are always going to be working with people, not just the patients who are unconscious on the surgery table, but in your maybe patients, if you're a GP or you're talking to the patients, and the nurses working with you, the other doctors, the hospital staff, the administration. They are all teams within teams. And if you are going to be working in a way to be safe and to take care of the people you are supposed to, and train those you are supposed to train, then the behavior of the group and how the group works together is extremely important. So it's applicable everywhere. So it's not just for fun. This you will learn something about real life, and I hope many of you will already know some of the main things. Now, before we go into the psychology aspect, I just want to go into some aspects of what we are talking about when we talk about spaceflight. Do you know what the radius of the Earth is? Any volunteer? None. Okay. You guessed right, 10,000 kilometers, about. At least Napoleon thought it was 10,000 kilometers because he based the measurement of the kilometer on being 1/10,000th of the Earth radius. It's not, but it's approximate. Do you know how high the ISS laboratory and all these orbiting astronauts are above the Earth? Have an idea. Let's get some guess. How many to the nearest 100 kilometers? I'm using kilometers and not miles. Sorry about that. How much? 500. Oh, excellent. About that. 350 to 500. That's about right. I'm just giving round numbers. Yeah? So when I put 400 here, 500 is also exactly the same. Because we're just talking of the ballpark figures. We're just trying to understand roughly. This is not a lecture in astronomy. We're just looking at psychology. Yeah? And we only want to know roughly what's going on, what our boundary conditions are. Because the satellites you're communicating with, these geostationary, they're communicating like the GPS navigation signals, etc. The old GPS ones, the new ones are slightly lower orbits. How high are these stationary satellites above the Earth? Does anybody have an idea? No? Those are more the low orbit satellites, yes. And the next GPS satellites will be some of them are low orbit, but many of them will be the 15 or 20,000, and the geostationary are 40,000. Quite high. When you think of how low the ISS orbit is. Yeah? So the ISS orbit is not very high. It's only from here, not even from here to Paris, halfway from here to Paris. How far away is the moon? Because we've been there. You guessed right, 400,000. Much further away. So we're talking of long distances. This was when Apollo 13 had their problems. They realized they will not be able to be rescued very easily. But actually, even 400 kilometers up there, when the space shuttle is up there, to send another space shuttle or a Soyuz rocket takes weeks, if not months, to prepare. So when the crew of the STS-107 mission, when they realized their shuttle was damaged, they realized they may not be able to come back down to Earth because one couldn't rescue them. And they didn't come back down to Earth. The STS-107 mission, they all died on the way down. This is a most tragic mission. We can talk about the psychology of it later. I was involved in that mission. I knew the crew very well, so it was a very sad occurrence. After that, I started going to other areas of spaceflight. I got a bit discouraged with human spaceflight. The moon gravity is less than the Earth. Any guesses? What fraction of the Earth's gravity? No guess. You're right, it's about a third. So it's much lighter. You see these films of the people jumping up and down there. Mars distance from the Earth. Now this is getting interesting because this is really far away. And of course, if you read science fiction, we're going to the stars. But that's the nearest next planet. Any ideas? Probably not. I won't wait. 450 to 400 million kilometers. So a round trip to Mars, if you're going to go to the nearest point, Mars has an orbit which is huge, and partly it's very close, only 50 million kilometers away. And that's where you get to it. And if you want to go there and come back while it's close to the Earth, because if it's far away it's going to take you years to do it, you would have to go and come fairly quickly, and it would take you about 500 days with today's technology. So a long time. If you decide to stay on it for a while, then you'd have to wait for an orbit, and that takes 2 years for it to come back again. So it'll take much longer. So it's quite far. The orbit is 2 years. Mars' gravity is similar to the Moon's, slightly higher. And Jupiter, which is another interesting planet quite far away, Alpha Centauri, distance from the Earth. This is the nearest star. So if you're talking about science fiction going to other stars, this is the closest one. It's very, 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 very close. And it's 4.3 light years. What's a light year? Well, it's the time light, the distance light travels in a year. 10 million kilometers, roughly. Huge distances. So if anybody tells you, if you see these science fiction saying we're going to get into this, into our rocket and fly off to another star and get there in a few days' time, it's all rubbish. It will take you a few million years to get there. So you won't get there. So unless we have some form of instant teleportation, but at the speed of light, which nobody can travel, and I can tell you because if you get anywhere close to the speed of light, your mass will go up infinitely, and you will need infinite energy to accelerate. So it's not possible. And even if you did achieve that, it would take you the 4 years to get there, but you wouldn't. So it would probably take you more like 4 million years to get there. So take science fiction with a grain of salt. A typical Mars mission will take 500 days for a short turnaround, 1,000 days for a longer turnaround. You're talking of long periods of time. You're talking of time delays. You can't hold a conversation. You say hello, and about half an hour later, you get the answer saying hello. So it's not very nice. Setting an SMS is going to be easier, because then you can wait a couple of hours to get your answer. So holding a two-way, even chat will be a bit difficult. So if you're going to do any telemedicine, if you're going to perform an operation and get some advice, I think you better get all the advice at one point and then turn your communication off and do what you have to do, because you won't be able to interact. So we are talking about people going to a place where they're going to be totally dependent on their own skills, limited source, food, etc., and being away for several years. So it's going to be a really psychological stress. What's space work today? In the old days, they mainly took crew who were test pilots. They were really the heroes. Roughly 40% of them died during their test piloting. Nobody knows much about that. So they were, those are the first astronauts. Nowadays, that's not the case. Some of the so-called soft characteristics are being seen as much more important, because you have a group up there, and the group has to function together, and you have the team on the Earth of a few hundred people operating the system, and they all have to be able to work together, and they have to get along together. And the psychological aspect of working together and getting along together is extremely important. So you have all these diverse agencies, diverse departments, research teams. On our Space Lab 1 mission, we had 100 different research teams, all working simultaneously with poor crew. So you can imagine, you are starting an experiment, and it's supposed to take 45 minutes to complete, and after 45 minutes you've only set it up because it's taken longer. The next experimenter on the ground says, well, it's my time to get the crew time, because this crew time costs 10,000 pounds a minute or whatever it is, and you have problems if you don't work very well. So you have a lot of stress. You have multicultural. Now on the station you have a Russian and 2 Americans, or an American and 2 Russians, or American meaning could be also the European crew who tags along with the Americans. Sometimes some other countries, Japanese and Canadians are involved. So you have a number of stressors, that's what we call them, like this timeline. You have symptoms. As a medical doctor, you know what those are. Sometimes it's too late when you see a symptom. Sometimes it's early enough to take action. And then you have the consequences of some bad psychological state if you've not taken quick enough or prophylactic action, action in advance to prevent something taking place. If you recognize a symptom early enough, you might be able to take corrective action in time. You have various types of stressors. I'm now going into the space psychology specific. Later I'm going to go into the normal group dynamics which affect everybody. These are the stressors that the crew feel experience in space, and this is partly because it's a space psychology course. We will go through these things first. You have the unique stressors of the space environment. I'll talk about those. The habitat, the mission operations, communications, the psychosocial stressors, both between you and your fellow crew and the ground, and talking about the ground space communications. The space environment, you are weightless. This can be a problem. When we were setting up our neurophysiological experiment, we practiced it on the ground very often with the crew. How to stick the electrodes to get the nystagmus, 2 electrodes, one above and below, another 2 left and right of the eye, etc. And we tested everything, all the signals, and we realized it takes 15 minutes to set up. Good. And then we can take measurements for 30 minutes. The experiment is 45 minutes, and then we can hand over the crew to the next experimenter. Because it was very tightly, plus or minus 1 minute, the crew time. And the ISS, it's a bit more tolerant time, but on a week's mission, it was very stressful. And the crew took 45 minutes to set up, so we had a problem. So things take longer. Your perceptual motor skills also are a little bit impaired. You have more complex performance. You don't move and act the way you do on the Earth. Everything is a bit more difficult. The first crew who go up there, when you film them, they're usually trying to do the Superman thing, or Batman or whatever, flying this way. It doesn't really, it's not very successful. The idea is you hold on to one of those bars next to the racks, and you give it a push, and then you move sideways along the racks, and then you stop yourself when you get to the right rack. So it's totally different than what you see in Superman. And they have to learn all this when they go up there. You have fewer environmental cues, whereas up and down. You could have your racks and your experiments on the floor. Well, they try to create an atmosphere that looks like 1G being the bottom, but it's not quite true. You can work upside down. You learn to read upside down after a while. Because you could be in any orientation when you're looking at your experiment. You have the dark and light cycle, which is totally wrong. You have some windows going outside, but it's every 90 minutes. You have your first day and night very quickly. And you have, last but not least, the so-called space adaptation syndrome. This is a polite way of saying getting sick, like being seasick, vomiting. It's just a polite expression. And roughly 50% of crew suffer from this. I have been involved in parabolic flight, where we try to experience a little bit of weightlessness to test our experiments. And I can assure you, many of us get very sick, and I got extremely sick. And it was so bad, I was having feelings like I wished I hadn't been born, I wished I hadn't gone into another. It was just terrible, terrible. When you are vomiting, and you are being still stimulated to continue, and this carries on for a couple of hours. You don't just get off your joyride in the Luna Park or whatever. You have to stay on board. And it can be an awful experience once you start getting sick and you can't stop it. Sometimes I don't, but some people don't get sick at all. And they do get sick in space. Fortunately, they adapt. After 2 or 3 days, they adapt. So the first couple of days can be very difficult. And on a 6-month mission, then it's not a problem. On a short mission, it can be. Let's carry on. We have other constraints: sleeping, eating, exercising. You have to do special exercise to keep in shape. You have a lack of privacy. Going to the toilet, defecating, urinating. All of these are real problems. It's not so simple. I remember once a colleague telling me they got some awful results on their experiment. It was some experiment that tested certain gases in the laboratory facility they had on board. And they were getting signals that they had never got on the Earth. And they debated what it could be, until one of them had a bright idea. And they tested it. Yes. One of them is smiling, yes. Somebody had farted on board. They had to test it on the ground by somebody farting into a plastic bag and then putting into the equipment and testing it. But that's what we did on the ground. And then finally they realized what it was all about. So the equipment was not failing, but this was the kind of thing. You fart on board and everybody knows about it. And you have a few hundred people on the ground debating the matter. You have very little privacy. One crewman was telling me, just maybe I'll entertain you with some little anecdotes because a lot of this you'll forget otherwise. He was on the Mir station and he was waiting for his fellow crew said he was going to go to the toilet and he had to relieve himself and he was going to be back in 10 minutes and they would do their experiment. Well, after about 45 minutes he decided to go and investigate what was going on. The Mir station was larger than the space shuttle, but not as large as the ISS, so he had a little way to go. And he went there and he saw his crew member with a bag in his hand, flying around with another kind of a net catcher and trying to catch things in the air, and asked him what he was doing. Well, he had not quite followed the procedure. Now, you're a medical student, so I'll tell you, because everybody doesn't talk about things like toiletry on the space station. They usually talk about fascinating, looking at the stars, and but the crew also defecate and urinate just as we do. And he had, the way the Russian toilet worked was, the procedure was, you sit on the, you have a certain orifice of some sorts, you put a bag into it, like some kind of a plastic or whatever, and you have a suction pulling through it. It's not a plastic bag, but it's usually some kind of a paperish bag that allows air through it, so the suction can suck through it. So when you defecate, it holds the material to the bottom of the bag. And the procedure says, first, you don't defecate and urinate in the same orifice. One you use for one purpose and another orifice you use for different purposes. It's a bit more complicated for women, but that's one of the minor problems in space. But we have done a lot of parabolic flight tests with women urinating on special type of containers. It's all the real problems of space flight. One doesn't talk about these things, but these are the less romantic aspects. And anyway, he turned, the procedure said, first put the bag in, turn on the fan, defecate, close the bag, and turn off the fan. And there's a special procedure printed there. Well, he had done it so often, he didn't bother reading the procedure. So he turned on the fan as he should, and he defecated, and he turned off the fan. Oh, did it the wrong way around. He should have closed the bag first. By the time he was about to close the bag, everything had flown out. And it was flying everywhere, and there have all kinds of air circulation on the station, pulling everything everywhere else, and going into the vents and between the racks and everything else. So he had to, as quickly as possible, try to perform a rescue operation to try to get all those feces before they start blocking everything up. That's real life in space. That's the romantic astronautics, the life of an astronaut. Of course, you are a little bit concerned about. You have a certain amount of fear. No astronaut will tell you that he's not afraid. He's afraid, but there is that. When the STS-107 was damaged with some ice on one of the wings, they couldn't do anything about it. And that was enough to cause the vehicle to burn up on its way down. So it's a very delicate operation. It's not so simple. Although very few crew get killed, it costs a hell of a lot of money to try and keep them safe. Because it politically doesn't look good if they die. And it's also not very nice. If you're going to go to Mars, that's really something. Imagine looking back at the Earth, not from the moon and seeing a beautiful Earth, but seeing the Earth shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until it becomes a point, like a star in the sky. And then realizing you may never go back to mankind again. Nobody knows exactly how we're going to react to this psychological stress. It's a new thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's an awful thing. What will it be? How will we react to it? Being separated from our loved ones. And this, being separated from the loved ones, when I talk to a lot of the crew who had been on the space station and on the Mir station for a long period of time, the longest was 430 days, and I asked them what was their main stress. They said they forgot about the safety after a while. But what they didn't forget about was their loved ones. And that was one of their greatest stress, being so separated. And if ever they talked to their family, which they were promised that they would have private lines, they were never private. They were guaranteed the right to talk with their partners, like a man talking with his wife, but they were told they were not supposed to talk to other people, just to their wives. But nobody would listen in. Well, strangely enough, one crewman told me he was talking with his wife. That was back in the Skylab days, 30 years ago, and his wife was saying she had been to the doctor, and the doctor had diagnosed one of the problems she had, and the medical doctor, who was a friend of hers, was standing next to her, and she said, well, maybe he will explain what the symptoms and diagnosis is. And she handed him the phone, and mysteriously the connection was cut off. So ground control realized that somebody else was on the line and not his wife, and it was not permitted. So they must have been listening. So if they tell you they don't listen and it's a private line, they're lying. So you can forget about the trust you can have with ground operations. They do listen in. You have to keep up with the timeline, as I was mentioning. You are constantly being watched, and you have to trust those on the ground whom you don't sometimes. And it's a problem. I remember one crewman said they had been trained with certain ground operators, and at the last minute they changed the operator, and they were there in space for 2 months with an operator they had never met. They didn't like the guy. They even went on strike one day and decided not to talk with him, and they didn't realize that they had forgotten to turn on the communication system. They had turned it off for some reason, and ground couldn't talk with him. And the ground control were terrified. They thought something had gone wrong with Skylab for 24 hours. The next day they came back on board and said, hello, everything's normal, but they had given him a punishment. They didn't know him, and they didn't like him. And that can be a problem. So the relationship you have to have a trusting relationship with those whom you are dependent on the ground. That's important. I won't go into that. Munze and Kass have suggested a number of areas of further research, which I've tried to, for each subject, posted a summary of what I got out of that book. And you can look at that summary. You have certain cognitive and perceptual motor skills. How do you retain them? How do you acquire new skills? How the impact on workload, on mental performance, onboard monitoring of automation. These are things that have to be researched. These, for every subject, I've included a list. I won't go into them because going into any of these would take a whole lecture. So I've just left them there as a list. You can look at it afterwards, and if you're very interested, I doubt if you'll have time to do so, you can look at that one reference book and read all about it. You have psychosocial stresses. As I mentioned already, you have boredom, demoralization, isolation from the earth, knowing you may not be able to come back, getting along with your fellow. These are the standard type of problems you could have on the ground, but they are exacerbated. You can't leave your group. You have multicultural differences. Just an example, I don't want to go into each of these, but during the NASA and Russian collaboration before the ISS, one crewman, he was an American, each crewman can take a certain amount of personal stuff with them, and they usually take some object like a book or some private thing that they really like, and they may take some food and that they really like. And the Russian took a certain kind of sausage, a special local sausage that his grandmother has made, and he wanted to eat it sometime during the mission. A great big preserved sausage. And after being on board for a month or so, he decided he would eat it. And being a nice guy, he decided to share it with his fellow Russian crewmen, and then they decided, well, maybe they should share it with the damned American on board. They didn't quite like him, but anyway, maybe it would be polite. So they cut it in 3 instead of 2. I mean, it was a limited sausage. And they were eating it very delicately, and the American took it and finished it. And then they looked and said, and? Did you like it? I mean, that was for them. They had been waiting 2 months to have that, and they realized the next 4 months or 6 months they would have nothing more of that luxury. So they had really sacrificed some of their wonderful sausage for him. And he said, well, our hot dogs at home are much better, you know, and well, I mean, I suppose one can eat it if one trains oneself to. I mean, this guy had difficulties for the rest of the mission. Didn't want to have anything more to do with him. There were other problems as well with this guy. I can't remember whether it was the same person, but I met one of them and on the ground before flight, one of these NASA people who had not got any of this sensitivity training or group dynamics training. And I remember seeing him in Star City, and the person taking me around said, "Hey, that is the next American going up there." And I said, "Hey, hi," I forgot his name. "Smile and I'll take a picture." And I had my camera with me. And he put his hand in front of his face. He said, "Nothing doing, you know, you can stuff your camera," and walked away. He was a bit embarrassed later on when he was officially introduced to me, because I was one of the chief scientists on the mission. And he met me again and gulped. He thought I was a tourist at first. And he said, "Oh, well, I mean, I didn't quite realize you were a scientist on the mission." Well, I mean, one should behave oneself anyway. He didn't get along with the crew on board either. Psychology is important, and that kind of behavior is not acceptable. Unfortunately, there are lots of people who behave that way. I won't go into all of this. A lot of this is very obvious to you. Hygiene, housekeeping, responsibility taking, sleeping, eating. All of these things are problems on board. On the ground, they aren't. But you have a limited amount of food. You get your little tubes of soup or your tubes of cheese or your tubes of whatever else, and trying to declare these things are delicacies. They're not. And eating is a wonderful thing on the earth. And when you lose that joy, and you've lost many other joys as well, it can be a bit stressful in space. You have preferred ways of doing things, a certain pace of working. You can't really. You have to work in the way your fellow crewmen work or the ground wants you to work. There are certain roles that maybe you are used to. You want to maybe save face if you're Japanese. It's much more important than a Dutchman who says exactly what he thinks to your face, and you think he's being insulting, but he's being normal. That's the way they live every day. We don't see it that way. I live in Holland, and I feel myself insulted by the Dutch people every day. Apparently, they don't feel insulted by each other. Well, that's a different culture. There is a certain amount of competition. That's the same thing with you. If you come across very useful information, are you going to tell your fellow student who is competing with you on the grades, or your fellow co-worker who at a meeting will be able to say, "Hey, I read about this research which is very important"? If you tell him, he might raise the point and get the brownie points at the meeting. Maybe you keep it to yourself. We have a certain amount of problems with that kind of thing, and this affects our everyday life. Are we better off sharing this information or not? We are. But how can we persuade ourselves that that is the case? We are stronger if we all help each other. If I help my colleague with what he's doing and he helps me with what I'm doing, we will save ourselves a hell of a lot of time. I may be researching into a subject that somebody else has already researched into and spend weeks or months. And if I can just talk to him over coffee and tell him what I'm doing, and he shares what he has done, we could be saving a lot of time for each of us if we all do it. Unfortunately, in most cases, in industry, in banks, in hospitals or whatever, one tends to want to keep information for oneself. Sharing, this is important. Of course, in space you have other things. Territorial. Well, if you have an office here, that's also a problem. Somebody puts their bag on your desk, or you have a part of a desk, and they don't respect that this is yours. This is your little area of the office, and that you really, that's the little part in the whole building that really belongs to you. And here somebody has been eating their sandwich and their crumbs and God knows what else on it, and maybe spilled some coffee on your chair while you were gone. You won't be very happy. In space you have very little space, so that's even a greater problem. I won't go into all of these things, but you have certain things go further. Once you begin to displace your anger if you can't talk about things. You can turn certain assumptions into facts. You get more fatigued. Your morale begins to go down. You begin to get more irritated if the problems are not dealt with adequately and in time. And this is true in space as it is on Earth. I don't want to sound religious, you know, on earth as it is in heaven, but it's roughly like that. We have different cultural norms. We have both positive and negative norms. We can blame others, we can complain. That's a very good thing. You know, when you get around to drinking coffee at your typical workplace, well, let's see now, which professor can we talk about who's an awful person, or which division head can we talk about who is up to no good, and whom can we blame for the fact that we didn't get any certain work done. These are so-called negative norms. We can also encourage positive norms. You meet somebody, whether you like him or not, and you train yourself to say, what good characteristic does this person have that I noticed in this last week? Let me tell him that. You know, hey, you're wearing a nice tie today, or your presentation you made the other day was very good, even though you hate him. You know, you'll be surprised that you begin to like the person you hated, because the person is so happy you've given him this compliment. He gives you a compliment back maybe, and you see he's not that bad a guy. Well, some of them are. But I mean, some of them aren't. So there are certain positive norms that one can develop, and it can be, they can be good for the group. So, but these don't come naturally. You somebody has to remind you and say, you know, you can do that. Oh, yes, I hadn't thought about that. I didn't quite realize I was always talking negatively about somebody until the person joins the group, and we finally have to shut up because he joined. To develop positive norms is a difficult thing. It, you know, reduces part of the fun of all this talking, gossiping, etc. But there are good positive norms one can develop, but one needs a certain amount of training, a certain amount of awareness. A certain amount of group dynamics training makes you aware of the things you are doing. That's why I think it's extremely important for people, especially in your profession, to have certain amount of group dynamics training, which is rarely done. And this is probably the only exposure you will get to it in your professions. But a group dynamics training is not just simply listening to a lecture, but this will help. It's going through something more detailed, but you have to want it. All these problems you will have on the ground can be amplified in space, and I won't talk about this too much detail. You can read all about it. Sorry to go through these slides, but I don't want to go through the boring things. If you don't like my slipping through a slide too quickly, tell me and I'll go back to it. I just want to get on to the next topic so we can have some more discussion. I've just tried to be complete in some of these lists of things, but I've already talked about some of these things. These are the issues that one is being confronted in. I think you can just absorb it very quickly by looking at that slide, and you'll see that I've already talked about half of these things. So I will just go on again. And what symptoms? We see certain symptoms occurring. We begin to see the person is emotionally labile or hypersensitive, more exhausted, becomes depressive or withdrawn. Each person reacts differently. Now, if you know the people, your friends, your relatives, and you see certain symptoms, if you've known them long enough, you'll know something is wrong. Hey, what's wrong with you? You're being too polite today. Or you're being too withdrawn, or you're quieter than normal. Something is wrong. And you'll be able to identify it very quickly. We should be doing this in everyday life with our fellow team members, and in space that's what one should be doing. And by getting to know each other well, that's why we try to sometimes train the crew and keep them together, they will be able to notice such things. The ground communications may be able to notice it. For example, in communications in German or Russian, one tends to use the Sie or Du in German. Or in French it's the vous and the tu. And also in the Russian it's vui and ty, which is more formal than informal. And this sometimes shows when a crewman is using one or the other, something is wrong. In Russian you might call somebody by their first name or by their patronym, or there are certain ways of communicating, and if you notice that it has changed from the normal, then you may notice something is definitely wrong. And these are the things that one should watch. Certain symptoms you might see with different people are different. Something is wrong, and if you notice it, try to help your fellow man, whether on your team, whether you're a fellow student, whether you're a fellow doctor, or in space. We can do that. And it's good for us when somebody else does it for us, because we are wanting people to recognize sometimes and take that. We are sometimes crying out for help, but we're not doing it consciously. This third quarter thing, well, if somebody's in space 6 months, one notices that about the 4th month they have their lowest point, or if they're in space for 12 months, it's about the 8th month. So this is a symptom that it's scientifically studied. You're kind of done half the mission behind you, still have roughly a little bit less than half in front of you, you're a bit down. Often the ground controllers will try to create something of interest for the crew so they won't get too discouraged and bored. There are other symptoms, insomnia, neurosis, etc., etc. Other consequences where you begin to become less compatible with your fellow crew if these problems are not dealt with. Your efficiency of work goes down. You begin to make more mistakes, which is very, very bad, and this could be dangerous for the mission especially. It could be dangerous for a medical doctor performing an operation. I just learned, I was staying with a medical doctor friend of mine, and he told me recently a surgeon had performed an operation of removing somebody's bad leg. Well, unfortunately, he removed the wrong one. Maybe he hadn't slept well. Maybe he had certain stress. Well, the poor person had to suffer with no legs afterwards. The same thing happened with, I know of another case where the doctor removed the wrong eye. I won't tell you other cases. One with the wrong kidney. These are terrible situations, but this happens when you are under stress. It may be that you make some errors, and in space you can make some critical error that can endanger the spaceship. But it's the same thing in your profession, in space. So a lot of these things you can carry over. You won't go flying into space. You took this course for fun, more or less. But you can apply a lot of these things in your everyday life. Group compatibility goes down. Cultural subgroupings take place. You begin to want to communicate with the people of your own culture instead of making the effort of trying to get along with the damned Russian who hardly speaks English. Scapegoating, blame somebody else, blame the ground, but it's very unhealthy. You don't recognize the leadership that was organized. You are there in space for a while, somebody else. There's a lot of things that can happen that are not very good, and if you don't recognize it, if you don't take enough action, and this can be the same groups, the same problems here on Earth. And these are some, I won't go into them because we will run out of time, suggestions for further research. You can look at this later. I will give you the copy of this PowerPoint. The Russians were fairly early on taking care of the psychological aspects. They had much more experience, and they realized it was extremely important, group compatibility. They tried to put a team together that got along. They did a lot of psychological testing to try to see whether people would work. They had even certain computer games, interactive games, things like that, to test to see how people got along. And they tried to put a team together they thought was compatible. And they were quite successful. That's why when they were working on missions, they tried to keep a team together once they had one. But still, despite their excellent work that they did, some 20% of the crew were still considered to be not compatible. What happened? Their tests were good, but with time it changed. It was not the same thing. After a few months in space, you were not the same person you were before. So you have problems. Some 30% were more or less, and some 40 to 50% were only described as being compatible. Sorry, 20% were not at all compatible. So it shows that simply putting the right people together is not enough. You have to sensitize and train the people to be able to continue keeping up their compatibility with each other. It doesn't just happen. It's not just passive, it's something active. They noticed differences, like weight loss if people were less compatible. They tended to work less effectively if they were not compatible. They communicated less with each other and with the ground. They made more errors. So there were problems, the real problems. It's not just simply a nice thing for people to be happy together. They work better. And it's the same thing in everyday life here on the ground too. If the team gets along and you work well together, then everything works better. So these are all the areas, and here again, recognizing, maybe I'll go into these very briefly, he suggests that one should try to research into these both demographic and personality characteristics, values, attitudes, which could be help to take care of the symptoms and the problems that could occur later. And this is maybe not so critical for a couple of months in space, but it is very critical if you're going to have a space mission lasting maybe a lifetime. Essentially, recognizing certain predictable determinants. It means you recognize when somebody begins to twitch their left nostril, that means the person is annoyed or he's depressed. For somebody else, it means they start blinking one eye or start farting more often or whatever. There are certain things, and if we get to know our fellow team members, we will recognize these things, and maybe we will start taking action. Maybe it's not the time to confront somebody about a problem, but to about something they've done wrong, but maybe trying to help them and give them a positive stroke if something is going wrong. These are the things that we call there's a certain amount of prophylactic action, recognizing symptoms, being prepared to take corrective action. So we go into the next one, and I'm going, unfortunately, too slow. I think I'm talking too much, so I'm not sure how to do this. We'll try to look very briefly at some prophylactic measures that we can be taking. I'll tell you something about research that is being carried out. I will tell you a little bit about some simulations where we locked people up, and a little bit about the Concordia Arctic Station where we are trying to do ESA is trying to do some research. I say we, I'm no longer really working full-time at ESA, but I'm a consultant there. Essentially, prophylactic measures include selecting the right people, putting the right people together, giving them certain general training, both as individuals in teamwork, leadership, conflict handling, making sure that they're a compatible team, and building the team. These are things that one can do. So one can take some action to try to make sure the situation doesn't get too bad. Actually, a lot of these things one can do also here on the ground. One can do a lot of leadership training and group dynamics and sensitivity and communications here with doctors, nurses working together. We have tried it out in hospitals. The nurses were quite willing to take part in such training. Doctors weren't. They said they didn't need it. They'd done enough training all their lives. Well, so the problems between doctors and nurses wasn't solved if only the nurses got training. So we have a real problem with certain attitudes which we have to handle. It's not so simple. So when you become a doctor and somebody suggests doing some training, remember, don't say no. Don't say you're good enough. You can also do with some help. So there are all kinds of characteristics one looks for, like motivation, attitudes, etc., etc. These are things that will take place when one is trying to select the right crew. We are involved in this because we are also considering selecting the right crew for the next Mars mission. What kind of people are we going to select? And I'll tell you that in the next hour. It's an interesting topic. We still haven't decided exactly how we're going to go about it. But these are the things which we have to consider. What kind of traits? Not necessarily the hero, but maybe the person who has other soft qualities. This is again where the Russians have had a lot of experience, and I've already talked to you about it. One of the examples was when the Russians are sending a team up there and one member gets sick, the whole team is grounded, which means that they'll fly on a later mission. The other team members don't like it, but that's the way it is, because they consider that one shouldn't break the team up. The Americans work differently. If a person is sick, then he is replaced. It doesn't matter that he comes from another team. And this can cause a certain amount of problems. It's just like you've been training for a certain work that you've been doing together for months, if not years, and then suddenly at the last minute, one member of your team changes. He's an outsider. He's a foreigner. He's different. It can be a big problem, how to deal with it. These are the real problems which one can get also in space work, how to handle it. You're preparing people for a mission from Mars that they've been training for 10 years, and maybe you have to break up a team because one member has become sick, and maybe the others will never go to Mars as a result. It can be a very great problem. How do you deal with it? I don't know. But these are the real problems that one will deal with. On the ground, fortunately, it's a little bit easier. I mentioned Patricia Santi. It's a good book to read if everybody. It's a very heavy book to read. That's why I would recommend more the Dragonfly. But for those who want to be scientific and see some of the background of the psychological problems NASA has had, then Patricia is the right one. We have some simulations we've done in space to recognize and measure all these things, to do some of this research that Munzi was suggesting, and to test some of the methods and to train. These are some of the ground simulations we've done. 30 days underwater in Norway, in a hyperbaric in a chamber underwater. Exemzi, that was done in also a hyperbaric chamber, but it was under normal air pressure for 60 days with 3 males and 1 female. There was another mission of 135 days in Moscow, and a very short mission in Canada, and an interesting one, Sphinx, which was 240 days, and that I'll talk to you a little bit about, because this one was not prepared very well, the Sphinx mission. They wanted to get some Europeans on board. They started the whole thing rather late. None of the space agencies officially collaborated, so they got the volunteers whom they could scratch the bottom of the bucket. So they were not the ideal subjects, which proved to be very interesting because they didn't get along. And it proved to be psychologically nirvana for the psychologists, because we don't want things to be very normal. We want people to have problems in order to analyze them. If they have no problems, there's nothing to analyze. So the psychologist always rubs his hands when he sees problems, because then he can collect data. And that was a very good mission in that sense. The Mars 500, they took care, because one of the problems of the Sphinx mission, the 1 female, ended up causing a big fiasco. They made sure they only had males on board. Unfortunate. That's not the way to progress. One should have handled the problem and done a mixed mission again and tried to correct it. But they were too afraid, and they decided to make it only a males-only mission. I think that was unfortunate. Just to show you some pictures to be entertaining, you've been having too much text up there. This was the Exemzi. They took you will see a hyperbaric chamber as part of it. This one here, and this was a so-called laboratory, and this is a storage area, and that's how they more or less lived. And this one here was the Sphinx mission. It was a long-duration isolation mission. It was supposed to simulate the space station and to simulate conditions there. The configuration of it, this is what it more or less looked like. It had several cubicles. And just for your information, it turned out that the Russians had a cubicle where they all shared one room, the 4 Russians, and the luxurious Europeans had several little rooms where they were allowed to have a separate bed in. So the conditions were not very equal. This is the way it looked like. This is where the Russian crew and then the visiting crew. What do I mean by the visiting crew? This is the way it looked like. These were the actual, because they were actually hermetically sealed originally. They didn't use it for that purpose, but the purpose was also to analyze how they could survive and how much oxygen was used, how many gases were emanated, came out, came in, etc. So there was a lot of work in this direction being done. For this particular mission, they didn't hermetically seal it. Actually, it was so unsealed that they unofficially were able to import in a lot of alcohol for the Russians, and many of them, by the end of the 11 months in space, were simply glazed eyes and drunk most of the time. So it was not a very well scientifically controlled mission. This is again the way the hall looks like. Huge big hall. So it shows that it's not that simple to create something like this. And essentially it was carried out in Moscow, and yeah, I already said that. And we had one crew which was 240 days. The next crew visited them for about 110 days. As I said, it was the last crew was very international, as you can see. This was the timeline, more or less. You had the first crew staying the whole time, and then visiting crews coming for shorter periods. So this more or less gives you an example of a complicated simulation mission. And then you had all the psychologists trying to do experiments during this mission. Now the simulation was riddled with interpersonal, intergroup, and intragroup problems. There were a lot of problems and a lot of issues, partly because they were not selected to be compatible, which was good, because then we were able to analyze such problems. There were a lot of issues, and some of the main problems were between the Russian crew and the international crew, the more totally diverse from culture, which is again what one would expect. Each team, we noticed, just the results to tell you, had a member who was an isolate. There were language issues. There was a female member who was a little bit uncertain of herself and sexually, and therefore she kind of ended up being provocative with the crew to a great extent. And then when the crew reacted, then she was very annoyed and offended, which is often the case. I hate to put it so negatively, but there was a cross-cultural thing. On New Year's Eve, Russians all kiss each other. Well, if you have only one woman there, she's the only one to get kissed. They kiss each other too, the males. Not so intimately. Anyway, it turned out that this one woman did not want to get kissed, and she was very annoyed. The main problem afterwards was not that. The problem was the ground control didn't know how to deal with the problem. She complained, and they didn't know what to do. Russians thought, here is a North American, the woman was North American, and she wrote an email to them telling them that she was almost threatening legal action, which is a problem. If the Russians tried to persuade the crew member to apologize, it means he has admitted that he has done something wrong, which means he could have some legal action against him. If he didn't apologize, then it would be psychologically bad. Now, they decided to go into consultation. Well, that was the 1st of January. Everybody was away, and those who were not away were drunk in Russia. So they had to wait a few days until they could get all their psychologists sober and their lawyers back from their vacation in order to consult and decide what to do. So until they reacted very soberly and very measuredly, it took about 5 days, which the crew were extremely annoyed, and the poor young girl felt she was totally neglected, which she was. So these were the kind of things that happened, which they didn't know how to deal with, unfortunately. So the situation blew up. We as scientists were told we shouldn't be communicating with the crew directly, although we had email, because the official psychologists should deal with such problems. So we didn't react either because we felt we shouldn't. So they felt neglected by us too. Very bad problems. So anyway, the next mission, Mars 500, they made sure there were 6 men on board, and they all got along wonderfully, and I think psychologically it was not so interesting. The first mission was much more interesting. But just to let you know, they did certain survival training. They did a certain amount of Mars simulation up there. And essentially this was to try to prepare a mission for Mars, but had almost no problems. We do have, I think I don't really have time, but I'll just briefly show you that there is a presentation on the Concordia station where some psychology and medical experiments are being done. This presentation is also up there, and it shows you some forms of medical experiments that are being done up there and some psychological experiments. You can look at this presentation, and if you're interested, you can look in the internet. There is also the ISS diaries, which are also very interesting. There is a document on that, which I've put on the internet, which you can read, analyzing them. There were very few people interviewed on the ISS diaries, not the Russians, only the Americans. And of course, the missions are approximately 6 months. And there was not much communication between the two groups, so not too many problems, because the groups were controlled, each with their own ground control. So as a result, there was not much interaction between the two groups and not much ground control problems because each group had its own ground control. So I'm not too sure whether this is that useful, these diaries. But anyway, there was also, these diaries were based on certain subjects, and I'll show you what the subjects were, and they were based on a French expedition to the Antarctic and another to the South Indian Islands. And so there are several sets of results comparing, the scientists tried to compare the two sets of results. Well, they are not identical, the two experiments, but it's still interesting. Here is where the French diaries on these expeditions to the Arctic and were taken, and they show here the importance of various characteristics or the various domains. Group interaction they saw as being the most critical. This is plotting what they consider the most important. Outside communications, the next workload, the next recreation and leisure, the next important. And way down somewhere is leadership. Where is that? Ah, yes, it's here. Not way down, but about there. Now, if you look at the ISS, you see it's slightly different. Work is here the most important and critical. Outside communications, adjustments, group interaction, far less important, and leadership way down. Why? I don't know. But there are differences. You can compare the two. I think it's interesting that there is some more work you can look at on this. This shows the phenomenon of the third quarter being more depressive than the other quarters. I won't go into that, but this is what I talked to you about. But this was also true on the ISS and as well on these Arctic missions. But essentially, it's very interesting to note that the group interaction, work, leisure, and leadership were rather different for the French and the Americans. Maybe the Americans consider work to be more important and the French consider leisure to be more important. Interesting. I don't know. If you're interested, look at the whole document and you will see how it's analyzed. But there are differences between groups, how they work, and what they consider to be important. I'm supposed to give you a coffee break after 1 hour. I've forgotten all about it. I talked too much. Is this terrible? Shall we carry on? No objections? If anybody wants to get up and go for coffee and come back or go to the toilet or whatever, just feel free to do so. If I stop talking, we won't have much more chance to talk and question. And if you have questions about all of this, let me know in between these different parts, and I can kind of stop and answer them. Or if you have interjections you want to make to so that you don't all fall asleep at the same time, just raise your hand or talk out loud. I don't mind. Okay, well, nobody's leaving the room yet. Good, okay. I don't feel insulted if you do. No? Maybe I take my jacket off. Get a bit warm enough. Leadership. I talked to you about leadership. Well, what is it? Are you all going to be leaders? Yes. In some way you will be a leader. Maybe a leader of a group of two who are studying together, or a leader in a small team working together, or in a surgery. In different ways. You could be even at a party or on some walk at 2 o'clock in the morning getting lost, and somebody has to take leadership to say, hey, now let's hold hands in this dark and get back home again and not get frozen. So one of you then has to take leadership. And this often happens. And what I have noticed in a lot of disorganized situations is that nobody seems to take leadership. And I have also noticed that if I do take leadership, people begin to follow. So it is a problem, leadership. Always one assumes that somebody else is going to do it. So I think I'll talk very briefly about that. It's not a critical item, but it's something to consider. There are different types of leadership styles. And this is good for you to understand these different styles, because it's not a matter of theory that I'm giving to you. I am not a theorist. If you want to have theory, go to the official psychology department and they will tell you about all their measurements on mice that they've done in the last 50 years. Because mice are the best subjects, humans are awful. But if you want to know about humans, then better don't go to the psychology department. I don't want to speak disparagingly, but often you can't take good measurements, scientific measurements on humans. That's one of the problems psychologists have. You cannot know exactly what the boundary conditions are. Each human is reacting very, very differently, and there are different circumstances. With a mouse, you can really put the boundary conditions very clearly. With an animal, with a human, it's very difficult. So you have directing. That's the strongest form. Do that. Leave. Coffee time. Come back in 5 minutes. Instruct. Tomorrow, you write this report, and you'll hand it in at 12 o'clock. Coaching, you explain why it's necessary, and you let the person take part of the initiative themselves. And you coach them in the hopes that next time they will need even less leadership, and they will only need supporting. You will support them when they are making decisions. This is another form of leadership. And once you've supported them enough, hopefully the next time you will be able to delegate to them and they will take care of it. They'll say, here is a problem, we need a solution, and I won't tell you how to do it, what to do, but you deal with it. And I trust you'll do a good job. And if you have a problem, come back. But probably if you have a problem, try to solve it yourself and don't come back to me. Delegating, proper delegate. It's your problem now, it's not mine. You're my deputy, and you sign the paper. You make the decision. You decide whether to operate or not. I'm not going to, don't consult me about it. That is total, from one extreme to the other. All of these are valid forms of working. And they depend upon the readiness level of the persons being led. Yeah? So, if you have a high readiness level, then you need low leadership. If you have a lower readiness level, you need much greater leadership. So essentially, with a low readiness level, you need directing, whereas with a higher, you need explaining and performing, and with supporting, with more readiness as you go upwards, you need less leadership. Clear. But it's a matter of recognizing the people that you are leading. What is their readiness level of your team members? It could be you have a very experienced team member who is 20 years older than you, but he has very little experience on the subject he's doing. He will need a much more leadership. So, but then you have to be much more sensitive how you do it. But this is, there is not one good way of leadership. There is a time and a place for different types of leadership. So, what is a readiness level? It's many different ways of saying it. It's how well you are prepared to do something, and how well not only prepared to do it, but it's a certain amount of willingness to do it. And essentially people are on a different readiness level for every task that they are trying to do. You have ability and essentially willingness. What does this mean? It means you have knowledge, skill, and experience. But it does not necessarily mean that you have willingness, motivation, and initiative. You could be somebody who is very well equipped to do something, but you're not interested in doing it. You could be very interested, but you are not able. So you are on different readiness levels. It does not necessarily. This combination of ability and willingness, in other words, the competence and the purpose, more or less, is what makes together makes the readiness level. And that will help you know what type of leadership to give and what kind of leadership is needed and is effective. So what we noticed in space missions, how do we do this? One should really give them some training regarding leadership, because once they're up there, they will have to function by themselves, especially if they're going to be on Mars or settling on another planet. They will certainly have to decide on their own who is going to lead and how it will be done and what kind of leadership will take place. And therefore, and one notices that when a team has gone away, you've gone on an Arctic expedition, it could be that the leadership roles begin to change. The person who was the leader is no longer the leader. He is not able to. He is sick or whatever. The ship is wrecked. The captain of the ship and the crew land on some island. And I don't know whether you know this one film on the subject. I've forgotten the name of it. But one of the crew members is very, very good at survival. He knows how to catch the animals and roast them and build things. The captain doesn't know how to do these things. And this low-level crewman becomes the king on the island, in a sense. And the captain, is serving him until they're rescued. And then the roles change back again. So the leadership could be very different depending upon the circumstances you are in. The captain was on a low readiness level on that island. The low worker was on a lower readiness level on that ship. So there was a change. So it's not handling management, that's an error. It's handling conflict. I'll have to correct this one before I put it on the internet. It was managing conflict, and I wanted to put handling, and I erased the wrong word. So it's handling conflict. This is a new theme. What is conflict? Now, this is something important because we are going to be running into conflict whether we like it or not in our everyday lives. Not we are going to be. We have run into conflict. We are running into conflict. Conflict is something which is not going to die on us. Unfortunately, it's going to. Unfortunately? Well, maybe sometimes it's a good thing. Conflict, a good thing? Let's look into it and see why. Any situation where your concerns or desires differ from another person, you can define as conflict, in a sense. We have conflicts all over the world. That's why we have wars. Maybe if they're all taking this course, there wouldn't be so many conflicts. I hope. Blessed are the peacemakers. That's what it says in the Bible. I'm sure in other religions you have similar sayings. It's cross-cultural and cross-religious, this advice. I just happen to know one of them. But yes, so conflict is something which we have to learn to deal with. It won't go away. And sometimes it's important that it doesn't go away. Because the conflict situation actually, how shall I put it, it publicizes or makes people aware that there is a problem. And if you hide the conflict and you try to ignore it, and you try to brush it aside and paint over it, the problem might get worse. So better to recognize there is some differences occurring very, very early on before they become serious. I don't know whether you, I can't remember what story it was. There are two family clans in Italy who have had conflict for 300 years and killed so many people of each other's family until they analyzed what was the origin of the conflict. Apparently, some 100 years earlier, somebody had stolen a chicken from the other backyard, you know. So in the meantime, 20 family members on each side had been killed and many properties burnt. And so one family finally decided, they purchased the chicken, went over to the other family and said, okay, here's the chicken. Here it is back. Let's have peace. It was as simple as that. So sometimes the cause of the conflict is easy if you can recognize it. I don't know how those conflicts of those South Sea islands will be between China and all these countries. That's another question. Conflict is normal. It exists. It's inevitable. It's a part of life. And there are some desirable aspects about it. We'll talk about that. So, at any rate, there are benefits in improving conflict handling. It strengthens relationships. If you handle the conflict well, it can reduce stress, improve morale, saves time and energy. Well, I mean, I don't have to tell you all about it. You know. And essentially, what are our objectives? We all have different conflict handling styles. And I'll talk about that. It's important that you recognize what your conflict handling style is. Assessing the conflict situation, deciding what conflict handling mode you should use under the certain circumstances. What do I mean by all of this? It's not that simple. There are certain types of conflict handling modes that you'll use under different circumstances, and not all of them are the right ones. You might want to confront somebody under certain circumstances, and other circumstances you may want to avoid or collaborate or accommodate. There are different things, different ways of approaching different circumstances under different conditions. The goal is enhance your own self-awareness, refine your own skills, and develop new ones. Well, you have to recognize what skills are missing. I'm an avoider, so I have to learn how to confront. A confronter may have to learn how to accommodate or collaborate. So, essentially we can look at this, or we can view it. I mean, there are many ways of viewing it, but this is one way. This is not the way. We have put this into two different axes. One is called assertiveness, that is being concerned with meeting your own needs, and the other is called cooperativeness. That means more or less concerned with meeting the needs of others. Everybody said, that's better. It's not necessary. If you are only concerned about meeting with everybody else's needs, you'll never make it. What do you want to do today? Well, I'll do what you want to do today. Well, I'm not sure. Then I know that my partner or my wife likes to go out to the opera, so I'll say, I think I would like to go to the opera. She knows that I like going to a football game. She'll say, well, no, I think I'd like to go to a football game. Well, she doesn't want to go to a football game. So maybe we're both trying to please each other. I don't know whether you know the story about the husband and wife who cut their breakfast buns in half, and there was the top and the bottom one. And the husband always thought that the wife liked the top part, and the wife always thought the husband liked the bottom part. Well, actually it was the reverse. And all their lives they were given the part that they thought their partner wanted. So it's not always the best to be concerned about the needs of others. One should always also be able to assert your own needs and state them very clearly. Otherwise, people won't be able to help you and please you. So, your conflict mode is your skill, what mode is your strength, and the situation. You might have a certain skill in handling conflict and recognizing the situation. So, let's look at this again and maybe plot this a little bit more in detail. At the bottom you have unassertiveness going to be assertive, and from uncooperative to cooperative. So, if you're going to look at uncooperative assertiveness, in this kind of situation, you're an assertive person and you're uncooperative, you can call it competing. You're in a competing mode. My way. On the other extreme, if you are very cooperative but unassertive, you might call it accommodating. To yield to the other's needs. It's okay with me. Whatever you want, we'll do it that way. So in a sense, these can play into each other. If one person is competitive and the other is accommodating, you will simply have a situation where one will be bleeding and the other will be milking or whatever. It's not necessarily going to be very healthy. What other ways are there? Well, you can also talk about being uncooperative but also unassertive. What do? You avoid. You don't want to cooperate, but you don't want to assert what your needs are. So what do? You just avoid the problem. Is this bad? Yes, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's good. There are certain situations where you shouldn't confront somebody on that day. You know that person has a lot of stress, and you know it's not going to be a good day to confront him. Postpone it for the next day, when he can deal with it, when he has calmed down. So, avoiding is not always bad, but it can be. Unfortunately, with those of us who are avoiders, then it becomes bad because they're always avoiding. The idea is not always to use the method you are tending to use, to try to learn to use those methods that you don't normally use, and to train yourself in these other methods, to recognize if you are assertive and Cooperative, well, that's one way. You say collaborative, well, we do what you want and what I want. I'm a cooperative person and you're an assertive person. Well, let's see now. Let's collaborate. This is sometimes good, but sometimes it can take too long and can be a bit complicated if we're always trying to meet each other's needs. Sometimes one way or the other way is the best way of dealing with the problem, and not a long drawn-out collaboration. If the person is dying and you're about to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the last thing you want to do is start discussing how to collaborate or even how to compromise in your approach. You have to be assertive. So, yes, compromise, sometimes it's good. You have two warring parties, and sometimes one has to compromise in between. Sometimes it's bad. When Chamberlain went to see Hitler, and Hitler said he wanted to conquer the Czechs, well, Chamberlain thought, that's a good compromise. Don't fight against us. Don't take on the Western nations. We will give you those Eastern ones. We don't care about them. They're far away. That was a compromise that Chamberlain made. He was giving away what wasn't his. That wasn't a very good compromise. It gave Hitler all the munitions and industry of the Czechoslovak Republic. He was given another year to build up his armies, and then he was able to attack the West anyway. So if Chamberlain had not compromised, Hitler would probably have backed down, and the Second World War would never have occurred. Or if it had occurred, instead of costing 50 million lives, it may have cost only 1 million. Well, that's a lot, but it's better than 50 million. So, compromise is not always the best. So, the general assumption of our society is that conflicts are bad and should be avoided, and that is, a good group is one in which there are no conflicts. And this is not quite true, because conflict sometimes airs a problem, and then it makes us aware that there is something that could be disastrous and that we have to handle it. And having a small conflict is like handling a small forest fire. You know, nowadays, to preserve the forest, we collect all the dry wood away to prevent small fires. That's the worst thing we can do, because these little bunches of dry wood is what often will get burnt when there are small fires, but the rest of the trees are so wet they won't burn anyway, and there will only be small fires. However, if you collect all the dry wood away, there won't be any small fires, and finally when it's a real dry day and all the trees are really dry and then there is a fire, everything will burn. So you don't necessarily solve a problem by postponing and trying to avoid that conflict. Sometimes it's good to have small fires to evade the big ones. And this is what we have to learn how to do. I think I'm going back on schedule because I've succeeded in catching up very good. So we have to see what we prefer as conflict modes, and where we are comfortable with certain conflict modes, but we tend to overuse them. So we have to analyze and reflect and understand what is our tendency, because if I'm an avoider, I apply this under all circumstances. Now, if I'm aware of that, maybe I would stop applying it under certain circumstances and be more confrontational where it's necessary. Sometimes I have to confront somebody and say, hey, you better have a shower or use a certain kind of deodorant because you smell. I really have to tell you that. I'm not going to just keep a distance. Or I don't like the way you do things because it's causing a problem. And the person doesn't realize they're doing something that will annoy me. So you have to confront sometimes. And avoiding will just make the problem worse and much worse. We tend to react out of habit. However, we may be causing unwanted situations without realizing it. So, let's look at these different modes. What is good and bad about them and when they should be used. So we talked about competing. Yeah? It means quick action, making an unpopular decision maybe, taking care of something vital, taking some protective action. The skills, being able to argue, being able to maybe use your position that you should be using as being the boss. Asserting your opinion, standing your ground. Sometimes it's necessary. So you have to learn to do that. And if that is your weak point, you should work on that. Because others who have that strong point will be winning the game each time. And you should sometimes be winning it. So that competing can be overused. You don't listen to feedback. You don't want to learn. You are not empowering the others. You gather people together who only say yes to you. Or you are not influencing as much as you should because you're underusing it. You are being indecisive. You cannot make a decision of what we're going to do tonight. And your girlfriend gets annoyed or your boyfriend gets annoyed or whatever. You are slower to act. You are not contributing the way you should. So there's underuse and overuse of competition. Learn when you should use it and when is the right time. And if you don't know how to use the competitive skill, use it. Learn how to use it. Accommodating. This means showing reasonableness. You are creating goodwill. You are keeping the peace. You are retreating. You aren't holding your ground. You're giving it up. You're putting yourself in a position of low importance. Sometimes it's necessary. The rich, powerful person should sometimes withdraw. The skill is to forego your own desires, to be selfless, to obey orders, and to yield. These things are good sometimes, and they are bad sometimes. And it's recognizing when to apply accommodation. And if you never accommodate, then learn how to. But if that is your tendency, try to use it less often. And try to be more competitive and assertive. So, you can overuse it, and thus you won't be contributing where you should be contributing sometimes. You have some good things to say. You are intelligent. You have thought of something that is useful for the team, but you're being so accommodating that you're not saying it. And the team is losing you as a leader, and they're not respecting you so much as a result. However, we should also, we can overuse it and we can underuse it. Avoiding. Mañana. Do it tomorrow. Why do it today if you can do it tomorrow? Well, that's not the right reason. But it sometimes buys time. It reduces tension. There are some good things about it sometimes. However, and one should learn how to sometimes avoid a problem. You see that there could be a big problem occurring. You try to avoid it today because this is not the right time to deal with this big problem. Try to deal with it on a one-to-one basis after the meeting with this person that you have a problem. Don't confront him in front of the others because then he will be losing face and he will battle like hard. So there's a time and a place to confront, and there's a time and a place to avoid. So you can overuse it by always postponing your decisions. That's what I tend to do. Or you can underuse it, and as a result, you will not be able to tell people when things are really critical and need to be confronted. You can collaborate, and similarly with all of these things, again, maybe it's getting a bit boring going into each one of them. Collaborating is the same thing. There are skills to develop with collaboration, but sometimes it can be taken too long to make a decision, and it's sometimes not a good thing to collaborate. For example, you can it will often you want to get something done, and you get into the collaborative mode, and it will take ages, and you have to make a decision quickly. Maybe that's not the time to collaborate. It's a time to be more competitive and say, hey, this is what I really need, this is what has to be done, let's do it, and that's it. And let's not have a long discussion of it. But sometimes it can hurt feelings. So one should be careful. So all of these skills, whether it be compromising, collaborating, all of these things have a time and a place. And we have to analyze that time and place, see what is the best skill that should be used, and it may not be the skill that we are equipped with. And therefore, we have to train ourselves to use that. So I, as an avoider, have to train myself to be more confrontational. And a confronter could be learning more about compromising, collaborating, or accommodating. So we should all understand and analyze what our skills or tendencies are, what our default way of doing things, and what kind of skills we don't have and we try not to use, and these are the ones we should learn about. And then try to analyze the situation when we reach it and use the right skill. It's a bit difficult, but with practice, if you're an avoider and you try confronting, you will learn afterwards it's not so difficult. You didn't get your head bitten off by confronting. It worked. And then you'll gain confidence in it. One can learn to use certain skills that you are not used to using. So, yes, we're on time. Before I go on to Mars, which is a totally faraway topic, I talked a little bit about it, but now we're going to talk about a real Mars mission. And so before I talk about this real Mars mission, are there any questions or points you would like to make on these leadership and conflict parts of this lecture? Yes?
Is there a certain type of person who wants to become an astronaut or a cosmonaut? Is that person going to be a leader? Is there a certain set of characteristics that person would have?
Okay, good question. The answer is no, and the answer also is, who should one select? So the question was, is there a certain kind of person who, type of person who wants to become an astronaut? Is he type of a leader or conflict handler, etc.? No, actually, there is a large diversity in types of people who want to become astronauts. Yes. But in the past, there were certain types who were selected. The hero type, the strong type, etc. So no, there are fortunately totally different types of people who want to become astronauts. Yes. Not all of them are the strong, competitive, etc., etc. No. And if you are thinking that that's the criteria for becoming one, no, it's not. Some of the soft strengths of psychology are very useful. Of course, you have to have certain skills of survival. But to live in space for a long time with your fellow man, yes, you need very different skills, psychological skills as well. But yes, there are those who are applying. There are all kinds of people who have applied. Yes, of course, it needs somebody taking the initiative. But there are fortunately very different types of people who apply. Yes. I can't give you figures though, because I don't have. I wasn't part of the teams analyzing and accepting the results, and I don't know whether scientific analysis was made of what kind of characteristics of people were the type who applied. It's a good question, though. I've just seen that there are different types of applied, but it's a good question. I think that could be a subject of research in the future. Okay, you can still ask about different subjects later. I mean, obviously later is... what is Mars 1? I don't know. How many of you heard of Mars 1? Any of you? No? Okay. Look it up in the internet. Mars-1. It's a project which fortunately, hopefully, will not be... This was an article in the year 2000 after the Sphinx isolation mission, the one with the girl who got kissed. And it was in a Canadian newspaper because she was Canadian. Mission to Mars, a nightmare looms. It was more of a sarcastic takeoff because of this Sphinx mission. In other words, you'll have a problem. Well, we hope this won't be the case because failure really is not an option. This is a very famous saying by a NASA manager of operations. What is Mars 1? This is a depiction. It's a mission instigated or inspired by a young man called Bas Lansdorp, a Dutchman, And he put together this project, which is a privately inspired project, more of a non-profit organization, and it's hoping to set up a permanent settlement on Mars. In other words, first to send up some vehicles to prepare everything, some robots and rovers to build up the housing and life support, etc. And when everything is working properly, then to send the crew to live there. The one little detail, we will be sending a crew of maybe 4 or 6, I'm not too sure how many, every 2 years, over a period of 10 years or so, until one has a number of people on board, I think something like 60 people in total. And they will be living on Mars. Now, there are some details which maybe are a little bit surprising. There will be a demonstration mission, a rover mission as said, and then once water and air are confirmed to be working very well, the astronauts will be sent up there. However, we don't promise the astronauts, or this team, the Mars One, I shouldn't say we, I'm just an advisor on the mission, don't promise them that they will come back. They are promised a one-way ticket. How many of you would like to go to Mars on a one-way ticket? Hey, wonderful! Interesting. Ah, well, you have to look on the website and you can apply. Oh, you've seen it? Hey, this is most interesting. I have to have you have to engage in part of the questions and answers and interrupt me. I have to admit I wanted to go to the moon, but I wasn't so keen on Mars. What we did was we said, how are we going to select them? And we had a discussion, and we sent out a questionnaire to all the faculty members of the Applied Human Sciences Department at Concordia University, about 40 faculty, partly because one of the advisors are there, Kass, and asked them what would be the 3 most important characteristics to select people to be candidates for a Mars mission. And they also sent it to roughly 40 graduate students who had had not current ones, but also past ones. Graduate students in applied human sciences are usually mature students who have a profession behind them, and then they've taken on an extra graduate course during their work, sometimes taking a month or 2 off, and got a master's degree in applied human sciences. And the prerequisite to getting a master's degree is working first. In other words, being a mature student. Most of them being over the age of 30, anywhere between 30 and 60 years old. And these are also sent to questionnaires. And of these 80 people, they were given only 2 or 3 days to reply. We didn't expect many of them would return with an answer in such a short time. Partly we gave them a deadline because we were discussing it last week. And I said to the team, hey, you know what? I'm giving a lecture on Monday. Maybe we could have the results by Monday. So we put a deadline in order to be able to present the results today. So you get it hot off the press. Nobody has it. You're the first people on earth to get it. And 60% replied of the people asked. And this is a very high percentage to reply within a deadline of 48 hours, to give the time and thought. So we were very impressed. It showed a great interest in this mission. So what did they identify? More or less, these were the main. We tried to synthesize all the results together. Well, I didn't do the main work. Some other team at Concordia University did it. They worked very hard last Thursday and Friday to get it ready, partly for you. I hope you're grateful. Resilience was considered to be important. You know, robustness in process and doing their best about things, and indomitable spirit, and the can-do attitude. The next Another characteristic was adaptability, being able to be flexible, changing one's ways, knowing how to move one's boundaries and extend them when needed. Adaptability, yes, because you have to be adaptable on such a mission. Curiosity, you have to be curious. You're always wanting to learn something new. Ability to trust, because you will be having to trust your fellow crew, trust those technicians who have made the rockets. Your life and the life of the whole team depends on it. So you have to learn how to trust, and with good judgment, to be self-informed, knowing when to trust and mistrust, be able to reflect, to trust oneself. And the last on this list, I don't say the last in importance, these are just listed, is creativity and resourcefulness. How to deal with the situation in a new way. Out of the box thinking. You suddenly have a problem and you have to solve it. Totally different. You have to just turn off the normal way of doing things. You're on Mars. You're no longer on Earth. You can't call the technician to help you. These was what more or less came out of this questionnaire. And what we more or less kind of summarize it, it's really, to a great extent, it's attitude. And part of this attitude is, we figured very important, is the sense of purpose. If you've decided to go to Mars and you're on your way, no return, the rocket is in one direction, you can't turn around, you don't want to doubt your decision. And if you doubt it, you have to be able to deal with that doubt. You have such a strong sense of purpose. You also need to be able to develop healthy relationships. Those people around you and those people who have already come to Mars, you'll have to get along with them, whether you like them or not, and develop healthy relationships with them. This is an important characteristic. You also have to learn to self-reflect. You have to sit back and say, what are my conflict handling modes? How can I deal with situations? To be thinking. You can't just simply take life as it is and not care. You really have to be able to analyze things to create a good foundation and a healthy atmosphere during such a mission. This is more or less what our conclusions were. So, thank you for listening. Do you have we have another 10 minutes which I especially left in order, I was curious to know what your reaction is to this one-way mission. And we have one person who says he's a volunteer. Maybe I ask you, well, what's your name?
David.
David. So you are enthusiastic to be a candidate to go to Mars. You're the first person I've met personally who has said something like this. What is your purpose and motivation? Because it could be a one-way trip and you'll be staying there. It may be the rest of your life. Maybe there won't be any, possibly no return rocket.
Yeah, I wouldn't like to go on the second mission. I'd like to go on the first.
Ah, okay, most interesting. That's even more challenging because you don't even know if you will succeed. Very good.
Well, I mean,
tell us a little bit. We are all a bit curious because I think all of us are a little bit surprised, and I'm very pleased that somebody has said yes. Is this somebody else's? Okay. Oh. Oh, no, I think I have to reject it. Sorry, I'm at a lecture. Can you call back in about 15 minutes? Who is it who's calling? Oh, I don't know. Missed call. Good. It was from Darmstadt. I think it's from the European Space Agency has a satellite and human space flight center in Darmstadt, operating space missions. I hope they have something for me. Sorry about that. Yes?
Well, I think somebody's going to do it.
Yes?
first mission.
Yes.
And I'm going to die up there if I go there. But sorry to get morbid, but like I'm going to die here too. Like it doesn't really matter to me where I die.
True.
And if I am the first up there, then I've made history. Like,
Yes.
And I'm a curious guy. I have the qualities that are on that list. Like,
Sorry?
I have the qualities that are on that list.
Yes, I mean, I've given you a head start because if you're interviewed, you know how to answer the questions properly to be up on. It's cheating, but it's okay. we'll be assessing. I'll be on the committee, so I may interview you later.
I asked earlier what qualities were qualities.
Yes.
Somebody who would want to become an astronaut. Where it's interesting that I just give you the answer to my question earlier. Like,
Yes, very good, very good. I mean, this is not the answer, but we have put together what some experts and ourselves have thought about. Possibly there are others. Now, this does not talk about technical and scientific skills, which will also be necessary. We are mainly talking about psychosocial, because we consider this to be one of the most important. Obviously, we take into account that you will be able to have talents like being a medical doctor, a computer programmer, a technician, etc., that can help repair things and keep things going. But there are lots of those people around. But we still will need them. But there are probably fewer people who will be able to survive such a mission psychologically and psychosocially. So it's a very important point you're making, that you are one of those who will be volunteering. Very, very interesting. None of you others will want to. And what are your fears? Do you have any reasons or questions or that you would direct towards David and myself regarding such a mission? We have another 4 minutes to discuss that. Yes. Let me answer just to let you know what the schedule is. If we decide to go ahead with the project, which the decision will be next August or July, then the candidates, at that point we will be giving answers to the candidates and starting our selection soon after that. And there will be roughly a 10-year period of training before the first manned mission. It's 2023, I think, will be the first manned mission, so it will be another 10 years. So you will have another 10 years on the Earth, a very exciting 10 years, because you'll be traveling and doing simulations in various dangerous and interesting places. You'll be interviewed all over the place. So it won't be uninteresting, but you being one of the if you want to be one of the first ones, it means by the age of 33 or 34, you might be on Mars, and that'll be spending the rest of your life there. Yes?
How big is the group that's going to go out?
I think we'll probably send 6 at one time, every 2 years. I'm not quite sure whether they've decided on 4 or 6. 6 has been the number that have been used in many studies. Even 100 years ago, some of the first books written on sending a mission to Mars considered 6 to be a nice number for survival and sharing certain different talents.
Are they expected to procreate now? Are they just doing research?
Yes, they could. Yes, I believe so. they probably will not simply be doing research, no. The idea is to start a settlement there. Obviously, we'll also be trying to build a system of bringing people to and forth. So maybe some of the children born there might decide to come back to Earth again. It won't be a one-way mission forever. It's just that the technology is not yet so highly developed that we can guarantee people coming back. I say we, I'm only an advisor, I should say, maybe say they, I'm not sure how to talk about it. But yes, I think this is an issue which one has thought that could be trying to allow a normal form of life development. I mean, what will happen if there be intermarriage, etc. There are certain problems occurring, so it's not going to be such an easy issue. But yes, why not? Yes.
Sorry, can I just quickly?
Yes.
So that's quite new. Just curious. The limited number of people that would be around you, kind of, for I don't know, that's 70 years of life. That's what you.
Well, I never experienced it, so I can't say whether it will bother me or not. But I mean, other people have, and I give it a shot.
But you don't think it's quite
I
sorry,
think, yeah.
rudely, it was kind of maybe we should get there and realise, oh wait, this is quite an issue.
Well, I think the thing that I've thought about the most is like, would I bring my coat? Like, I wouldn't have like my mate with me that I would normally have. Right? Maybe like she would come later. But what a thing to ask. Yeah.
It's a good question. I'm not too sure how we would deal with that when somebody says they'll go up there only if they have a girlfriend. You know what we're talking about, Kevin?
Well, we're talking about Dave's suicidal ambition.
As a closure, I always try to add a new part to my lectures and try to shorten the other parts. So I talked extremely quickly in order to bring up the Mars 1 mission, which was very helpful. Of sending people on a one-way mission to Mars. I have to admit, I didn't even hear about it until I was asked to be an advisor on the mission. And I reacted with shock and said, oh, I'm not too sure that I should associate myself with such a ridiculous venture, was my first reaction. But then I thought, well, I mean, okay, I'll maybe I should give my advice also as a doubter. So I accepted to be an advisor. Have you had anything to say, Kevin, on this?
Well, in the one-way mission thing has come up before. There was sort of rules that we thought about to follow, but not followed. But I mean, the perspective on what is acceptable mission profile and risk changes throughout your life depending on what's happening to you. I'm quite surprised if you willing to take it on. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the astronaut that will probably put their hand. If they were going to be first, put their hand up. That's true, though, isn't it? But this is Professor Goldflaus with the lecture tomorrow, actually, but he's been a colleague of friend, and it's going back to NASA to run their team and now I forget the human research program very shortly, so we're lucky to do it. But if you sit in a room with American astronauts and you say the risk of something is the risk of you dying something is about 4%, they all put their hands up and say roughly the risk of shock. And then so what would you go for? Risk was 10%, most of the hands stay up. And then say if it was 50%, they go, well, I'll probably first. If you say 100%, they say, yeah, I'll probably first, they'll probably do it. Especially if you want to.
I don't know what the figure is for the test pilots who, in those days,